the hypocrite who found truth after condemning his own books. Leo Tolstoy, imagine a man, a titan of literature, whose words have shaped the consciences of millions. His novels, vast tapestries of human experience, delve into the deepest recesses of the soul, wrestling with faith, morality, and the very meaning of life. He is Leo Tolstoy, a name synonymous with profound insight and unwavering truth. Yet, within this same man, a gnawing dissonance resided. He wrote piercing critiques of societal hypocrisy, of the gulf between proclaimed ideals and lived realities. He condemned the superficiality of the church, the corruption of the state, the vanity of the aristocracy, a world he himself had, for a time, inhabited and masterfully depicted. But then, a startling paradox emerged. In his relentless pursuit of authenticity, in his fierce condemnation of falsehood, he found himself turning his most potent critiques upon his own life, upon the very books that had brought him global acclaim. He began to see his own celebrated works, the pillars of his literary legacy, as not just flawed, but as potentially harmful, as complicit in the very deceit he fought so vehemently against. This wasn't a minor adjustment of perspective. It was a seismic shift, a radical renunciation that questioned the value, even the morality, of his own creative output. This isn't merely a biographical footnote. It's a profound philosophical crossroads that speaks directly to our own struggles with integrity and authenticity. How often do we champion ideals, only to find ourselves falling short in our own lives? How do we reconcile the narratives we craft about ourselves and the world with the often messy, contradictory reality of our existence? Tolstoy's crisis forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the pursuit of truth can be a deeply destabilizing force, capable of dismantling even the most cherished structures of our identity and achievement. He who wielded language with unparalleled precision to expose the flaws in others was compelled to turn that same incisive gaze inward, to scrutinize the very source of his influence. This script embarks on a journey into this extraordinary internal conflict, exploring how a man who seemingly had it all, fame, talent, a profound understanding of the human condition, could arrive at a point where he felt compelled to disown his life's work, not out of a loss of skill, but out of an overwhelming, almost agonizing, demand for an uncompromised truth. We will explore the nature of this profound internal crisis, not just as a fascinating historical event, but as a mirror reflecting our own inherent human tension between aspiration and actuality. Tolstoy's story is not about a writer's block, nor is it about a simple change of heart. It is about the radical implications of taking one's own moral and philosophical convictions to their absolute extreme, even when that extreme leads to the apparent self-destruction of one's public persona and artistic legacy. What does it mean to live a life truly aligned with one's deepest beliefs, especially when those beliefs demand a dismantling of the very foundations upon which one has built one's existence? This is the question that echoes through Tolstoy's later years, a question that resonates with anyone who has ever grappled with the chasm between who they are and who they believe they ought to be. We will delve into the philosophical underpinnings of this crisis, seeking not to judge, but to understand the relentless, often painful, journey of a soul in pursuit of an unassailable truth. A journey that began with condemnation and, perhaps, led to a different kind of discovery. The philosophical core of Tolstoy's later crisis lies in a profound re-evaluation of art's purpose and moral obligation. Prior to his radical shift, his literary output, while deeply moral in its exploration of human nature, was largely understood within the framework of aesthetic achievement and intellectual engagement. He was a master craftsman, weaving intricate narratives that captivated and educated. However, as his spiritual and ethical convictions intensified, he began to question whether the very act of creating beauty, of exploring complex psychological landscapes for their own sake or for the intellectual edification of the elite could still be considered a virtuous endeavor. He saw the potential for art, even art with noble intentions, to become a form of escapism, a distraction from the urgent demands of righteous living and social justice. Consider the burgeoning artistic movements of his time, often focused on subjective experience and formal innovation. Tolstoy, increasingly drawn to a stark, almost ascetic simplicity of belief, viewed such pursuits with suspicion, seeing them as a decadent indulgence that diverted energy from the essential work of moral self-improvement and service to others. Burgeoning skepticism toward art's conventional role led him to a radical redefinition of what constitutes good art. He posited that true art, in its highest form, should not merely entertain or provoke thought, but must actively contribute to the spiritual unity of humanity. This unity, for Tolstoy, was achieved through the expression of universal feelings that bind people together, particularly those rooted in love, compassion, and a recognition of shared human vulnerability. He famously championed the art of the common people, folk songs, simple parables, the unadorned expressions of faith and suffering, as possessing a purity and moral power that the sophisticated creations of the educated classes often lacked. He began to see his own novels, with their complex characters, nuanced social commentary, and intricate plot lines, as potentially creating division rather than unity, as catering to a specific class of readers rather than speaking to the fundamental human heart. Now, reflect on this. How often do we praise art for its complexity, its intellectual challenge, its ability to shock or provoke? Tolstoy's later perspective compels us to ask if these very qualities might, in fact, alienate us from a more profound communal experience of truth. Furthermore, this shift represented a deep dive into the concept of authenticity as the ultimate arbiter of value. Tolstoy's earlier works, while grappling with moral questions, were still products of his privileged position and intellectual prowess. He could analyze, dissect, and articulate the plight of the poor or the hypocrisy of the powerful from a position of relative detachment. As his spiritual awakening deepened, however, he felt an overwhelming imperative to live in accordance with the truths he espoused, to embody them in his daily life, and to strip away any pretense or artifice that might obscure genuine connection. This meant confronting the inherent hypocrisy of being a wealthy landowner who preached non-resistance to evil, or a celebrated author who advocated for a life of simplicity and manual labor. His condemnation of his own books stemmed from a dawning realization that, despite their thematic explorations of morality, they were, in a sense, still products of the very world he was coming to reject. They were creations of a privileged intellect, not the direct outpourings of a soul stripped bare and living in radical obedience to spiritual law. Consequently, he began to distinguish sharply between false art, which he believed served to corrupt and distract, and true art, which he saw as a vehicle for spiritual contagion, for the direct transmission of loving feeling from one person to another. His own literary masterpieces, once the pinnacle of his achievement, were now re-examined through this new, uncompromising lens. He questioned whether the intellectual and emotional engagement they demanded, the very artistry that had made them so celebrated, might paradoxically hinder the direct, unmediated experience of the spiritual truths they contained. This was not a rejection of the themes he explored, but a profound doubt about the form in which he had explored them, and whether that form itself had become an impediment to the very spiritual unity he now sought above all else. Tolstoy's later critique of his own oeuvre also engaged deeply with the philosophical concept of existential commitment and the burden of self-creation. Having wrestled with the superficiality of societal norms and intellectual discourse, he arrived at a point where he felt his artistic endeavors, however sincere in their initial intent, were ultimately a form of self-deception, a sophisticated evasion of the raw, unmediated confrontation with existence. This wasn't about a lack of talent. It was about the perceived ethical weight of his creative choices. He began to see the act of writing, of crafting narratives and characters, as a deliberate act of imposing order and meaning onto a reality that he increasingly believed was best. Approached with a radical openness, a willingness to surrender to what is, rather than to sculpt it into something more palatable or aesthetically pleasing. Building on this, however, Tolstoy's Condemnation reflected a profound disillusionment with the efficacy of intellectualism in achieving genuine moral transformation. He had spent decades dissecting the human psyche, exploring the intricacies of social dynamics, and articulating complex ethical dilemmas. Yet, he observed that this intellectual engagement, while perhaps enriching for the reader, did not necessarily lead to a fundamental change in behavior or a deeper spiritual connection. He witnessed the continued prevalence of the very vices he so eloquently described, suggesting that intellectual understanding alone was insufficient to overcome ingrained human failings. Consequently, he began to champion practices that he believed fostered direct, embodied ethical experience, manual labor, asceticism, and a life lived in service to the simplest human needs. Consider the profound dissonance he must have felt when, after writing War and Peace, a monumental work exploring the grand sweep of history and the individual's place within it, he recognized that the very act of creating such a vast, intricate fictional world might be seen as a distraction from the yasta, immediate, tangible suffering of those around him. He was no longer content to merely represent truth. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to embody it, to live in a way that stripped away all artifice, all the elaborate structures of narrative and character that had defined his public life. This led him to question the morality of his privileged existence as a celebrated author, seeing it as a gilded cage that insulated him from the very truths he sought to convey. Furthermore, another crucial layer is the philosophical tension between immanence and transcendence in the pursuit of the divine. Tolstoy's early works, while exploring spiritual themes, often remained grounded in the observable world, analyzing human motivations and societal structures. His later phase, however, increasingly emphasized a transcendent reality, a spiritual truth that could only be accessed by shedding the preoccupies of the material and the intellectual. He came to believe that the very act of engaging with art, which is inherently tied to the material realm of language and form, could become an obstacle to this direct, unmediated communion with the divine. Now, consider how this applies when you face a similar internal conflict. Perhaps you've championed environmentalism with passionate essays, only to realize the carbon footprint of your own lifestyle is substantial. Or you've advocated for radical honesty in relationships, yet find yourself carefully curating your online persona. Tolstoy's crisis isn't about personal failure, but about the radical implications of taking one's convictions to their absolute, uncompromising end, even when that end leads to a profound questioning of one's life's work and identity. His struggle invites us to examine the ways in which our own creative or intellectual pursuits might, paradoxically, serve as a barrier to the very truths we seek to express or embody. He was, in essence, wrestling with the existential burden of a life that must be lived in absolute fidelity to a discovered truth, a truth that demanded the dismantling of his most cherished achievements. Tolstoy's profound shift also brought into sharp focus the philosophical distinction between imitation and inspiration in artistic creation. He began to perceive his earlier novels not as original expressions of truth, but as sophisticated imitations of literary conventions, skillfully rendered but ultimately lacking the raw, authentic spark that could genuinely ignite spiritual understanding. In others, this wasn't a critique of plagiarism, but a deeper concern that the very act of adhering to established narrative structures and character archetypes while aesthetically pleasing, could inadvertently create a veil, obscuring the more direct, unmediated apprehension of spiritual realities. He saw the established literary world, with its awards, critical acclaim, and academic study, as a system that often rewarded skillful imitation and adherence to form over the challenging, often disruptive, emergence of truly original spiritual insight. Consequently, he sought to champion art that arose from a place of deep personal conviction and direct experience, art that was less about the craft of storytelling and more about the contagion of feeling. This led him to re-evaluate the role of emotional expression in art. While his earlier works were lauded for their psychological depth and nuanced portrayal of human emotions, Tolstoy's later perspective emphasized the importance of universal, unifying emotions, love, compassion, and a sense of shared humanity, rather than the more individualized, often isolating psychological complexities he had previously explored. He began to believe that art, which delved too deeply into the unique, idiosyncratic feelings of an individual, even with great skill, risked alienating the audience, creating a sense of separation rather than connection. Furthermore, this re-evaluation touched upon the philosophical idea of the aesthetic as a potential barrier to ethical action. Tolstoy observed that the beauty and intellectual stimulation offered by art could, for many, become a substitute for genuine ethical engagement. The act of appreciating a novel that depicted suffering or injustice, without consequently being moved to alleviate that suffering or correct that injustice in one's own life, struck him as a form of moral complacency. His own novels, he feared, might have inadvertently fostered such a passive appreciation, allowing readers to engage with profound moral questions from the safety of their armchairs, without the imperative to translate that understanding into live-action.now. Consider how this applies when you find yourself deeply moved by a documentary about a distant crisis, yet your daily habits remain largely unchanged. Tolstoy's journey compels us to question whether our engagement with art, our appreciation for its insights, might be serving as an aesthetic buffer, a way of acknowledging suffering or injustice without the demanding responsibility of direct participation in its resolution. He recognized that the very elegance of his prose, the captivating nature of his narratives, could create a pleasurable distance from the often uncomfortable realities he depicted, thus undermining the potential for art to be a catalyst for radical personal change and active participation in the betterment of the world. His condemnation was, in a sense, a plea to strip away the ornamental, to confront the raw essence of truth without the mediating layers of sophisticated artistry that, he now believed, could dilute its power. Tolstoy's later introspection also grappled with the philosophical notion of the ethical imperative of radical simplicity and its conflict with intellectual and artistic complexity. Having achieved immense fame and intellectual recognition, he felt an almost unbearable dissonance between the sophisticated, often abstract, nature of his literary explorations and the fundamental truths he believed all humans must live by: truthfulness, labor, and brotherly love. He began to see the intricate plots, the nuanced character development, and the elaborate psychological portraits that had defined his earlier masterpieces as inherently tied to a life of privilege and intellectual indulgence, a life increasingly alien to the core principles he now held sacred. His novels, in this new light, were not merely artistic achievements, but manifestations of a life that was, in his eyes, fundamentally out of alignment with the highest moral demands. He felt that the very act of crafting such elaborate works was a form of intellectual vanity, a sophisticated distraction from the direct, unadorned practice of living a good life, a life characterized by hard work and honest service. Consequently, he started to champion a form of artistic expression that was stripped bare, focusing on conveying universal feelings and moral lessons with the utmost clarity and directness. much like the parables of Christ or the folk tales of the peasantry. He saw the elaborate structures and stylistic flourishes of his own celebrated novels as potentially creating a barrier, an aesthetic indulgence that could dilute the potent, life-altering impact of pure moral truth. He felt that the intellectual engagement his books demanded, while valuable in its own right, could also serve as a sophisticated form of escapism, allowing readers to grapple with profound ethical questions from a safe, detached distance, without the imperative to translate that understanding into tangible, everyday action. The very artistry that had earned him acclaim now felt like an impediment to the direct, unmediated transmission of spiritual insight. Furthermore, this self-critique brought to the fore the philosophical tension between the pursuit of subjective artistic expression and the demand for objective moral truth. Tolstoy, in his later years, moved away from an emphasis on individual creative vision and toward a conviction that true art must reflect universal moral principles, principles that were not subject to personal interpretation or aesthetic preference. He began to believe that his own literary output, born from his unique perspective and artistic sensibilities, might inadvertently promote a relativistic view of morality, where truth was contingent on individual taste or intellectual framing. He felt a growing responsibility to articulate a singular, unwavering moral message, one that could unite humanity rather than reflect its diverse, often conflicting experiences. Now, consider how this applies when you champion a particular viewpoint, only to realize your own methods of communication might inadvertently be polarizing or alienating those you wish to reach. Tolstoy's radical self-assessment compels us to question whether our own creative or intellectual expressions, however well-intentioned, might be unintentionally reinforcing the very divisions or superficialities we aim to overcome. His condemnation of his own books was not a rejection of the ideas he had explored, but a profound doubt about the form and context of their expression, a realization that his life's work, as it stood, might be more a testament to his own intellectual prowess than a pure conduit for the moral and spiritual truth he increasingly felt compelled to embody and disseminate with unvarnished clarity. He was, in essence, seeking to shed the ornate robes of the celebrated artist for the simple, unadorned garb of a prophet, even if it meant disavowing the very masterpieces that had clothed him in fame. Tolstoy's internal crisis also interrogated the very nature of artistic intention versus artistic impact, a philosophical quandary that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever created or consumed art. He began to question whether his profound personal intentions to explore truth, to expose hypocrisy, to foster moral growth were sufficient to redeem the actual effect his works had on readers and on his own life. It wasn't enough, he concluded, to intend good. The art itself had to demonstrably do good, to act as a direct agent of spiritual contagion. This marked a significant departure from a purely aesthetic or intellectual appreciation of art, shifting the focus to its palpable moral consequence. He observed, for instance, how readers would praise the psychological realism of Anna Karenina, dissecting her motivations with intellectual rigor, yet remain seemingly unmoved to alter their own comportment in their marriages or social interactions. This disconnect between intellectual engagement and lived ethical transformation became a source of profound unease. Building on this, however, Tolstoy's later critique explored the philosophical concept of the corrosive influence of societal validation on authentic spiritual pursuit. He recognized that the accolades, the critical acclaim, and the immense popularity of his novels had, in a subtle yet insidious way, begun to shape his own perception of value. The very system that celebrated his literary achievements, he realized, was built upon foundations he was increasingly coming to condemn. A focus on material success, social status, and intellectual prestige rather than genuine spiritual attainment. Consequently, he felt that his continued engagement with this system, even by producing more acclaimed works, was a tacit endorsement of its values. This led him to a radical conclusion, that to truly pursue spiritual truth, he had to dismantle the very structures of his success, to deliberately alienate the audience and the critics who had elevated him, even if it meant being perceived as a madman or a hypocrite by the very society that had once lionized him. Furthermore, this introspection led him to a profound consideration of the philosophical weight of inherited cultural narratives and their potential for spiritual distortion. Tolstoy, deeply steeped in Russian orthodoxy and Christian scripture, began to see how centuries of interpretation and institutionalization had, in his view, obscured the pure radical message of Christ. He felt that the very language and forms of religious discourse, much like the literary conventions he critiqued, had become encrusted with tradition and ritual, hindering direct access to divine truth. His condemnation of his own books was, in part, an extension of this critique of established systems of meaning. He questioned whether his novels, by engaging with and reinterpreting these inherited narratives through the lens of literary art, were inadvertently perpetuating the very distortions he sought to overcome. He longed for a return to a more primal, unmediated understanding of spiritual principles, one that transcended the complexities of artistic and religious institutions. Now, consider how this applies when you find yourself championing a cause, only to realize the very language or methods you employ are perceived as alienating by those you hope to reach. Tolstoy's journey compels us to ask if our own attempts to communicate truth, however sincere, might be inadvertently bound by the very cultural or intellectual frameworks we are trying to challenge. His disavowal of his own literary legacy was not an act of artistic self-flagellation, but a courageous, albeit radical, attempt to align his outward life with his innermost convictions, recognizing that the celebrated creations of his past might, in fact, be impediments to the pure, unadulterated pursuit of spiritual truth he now prioritized above all else. Reflecting on this journey so far, we've journeyed through a landscape where the pursuit of an unvarnished truth led us celebrated artists to question the very foundations of his life's work. We've seen how the relentless internal examination of one's own convictions can illuminate not just the flaws in external systems, but the potential for those systems to become deeply embedded within our own creations, even our most cherished ones. It's as if the very brilliance of his artistic creations, once a source of pride, began to cast long shadows, revealing a terrain where perceived authenticity demanded a dismantling of established forms and the comfortable structures of recognition. The intricate tapestry of human experience he so masterfully wove now seemed, to him, to obscure a more fundamental, unadorned reality. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the emergent understanding that the quest for genuine moral alignment is not a static destination, but a dynamic, often arduous process of continuous reevaluation. The insights gleaned from grappling with the role of art, the weight of societal validation, and the very essence of spiritual transmission converge to suggest a profound truth, that our most deeply held beliefs, when rigorously applied, can necessitate a radical reorientation, an almost alchemical transformation of our relationship with our own achievements. It's akin to discovering that the map you've meticulously drawn, while accurate in its representation, might lead you away from the very territory you truly seek to inhabit. The journey has revealed that the commitment to truth can, paradoxically, demand a shedding of the very instruments that facilitated its initial discovery. In light of these interwoven insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not in the sense of providing easy answers, but in illuminating the profound questions that arise when one dares to live in absolute fidelity to discovered principles. Profound internal dissonance, the redefinition of artistic purpose, and the critique of societal structures all point towards a singular, compelling imperative: the need to continuously interrogate the space between what we espouse and how we live, particularly when our espoused truths call for a fundamental reordering of our existence. This convergence of ideas invites us to contemplate the enduring challenge of integrating our deepest ethical aspirations with the tangible realities of our lives, and the courageous, often unsettling, steps such integration might require. The profound internal reckoning of Leo Tolstoy, a man who once held the world captive with his literary genius, ultimately led him to a place of radical self-disavowal, a testament to the uncompromising nature of truth when it truly takes root in the soul. His journey was not one of mere artistic or intellectual evolution, but a seismic shift in his very being, a profound reorientation of his life's purpose. He found himself the celebrated author of epics, questioning the moral legitimacy of the very craft that had defined him, not out of a loss of skill, but out of an overwhelming conviction that true living demanded an absolute shedding of artifice, even the artifice of art itself. This wasn't a quiet renunciation. It was a thunderous declaration that the pursuit of authentic truth could, and perhaps must, demand the dismantling of one's most cherished achievements. What we glean from this extraordinary human drama is not a blueprint for how to discard one's life's work, but a potent illustration of the ultimate, often terrifying, integrity that arises when one's deepest convictions are not merely intellectual propositions, but existential imperatives. Tolstoy's crisis compels us to look inward, not just at the ideals we profess, but at the often unseen ways our creations, our successes, and our very identities can become gilded cages, insulating us from the raw, unmediated encounter with the truths we claim to champion. The paradox lies in the realization that the brilliance of our insights can, at times, become the very veil that obscures a more fundamental, unvarnished reality. It is a powerful reminder that the commitment to truth is not a destination reached, but a continuous, often arduous, process of reevaluation, a willingness to let go of even the most beautiful and familiar structures when they no longer serve. The higher calling of authentic living, the true practice begins now, not in grand gestures of renunciation, but in the quiet, persistent interrogation of our own lives. Where do our proclaimed values diverge from our lived realities? In what subtle ways do the instruments of our expression, our words, our actions, our very sense of self, become impediments to the very truths we seek to embody? Tolstoy's legacy, in its later, self-effacing chapters, offers not an endpoint, but a profound invitation to courageously examine the space between our aspirations and our actuality, and to cultivate the inner fortitude to realign our lives with our deepest truths, even when that alignment demands the unsettling, yet ultimately liberating, act of shedding what we once believed defined us. The enduring echo of his struggle is a call to a more radical, uncompromised form of living, where authenticity is not a product of creation, but the very soil from which genuine being grows.